So we have all of these great seats up here at the dais, and now everybody's going to sit down on the floor level.
Nobody went up there.
Oh, now that's how it's going to be now, is it? Jane's going to come sit next to me.
Let me get my stuff. It's over there.
Okay. So I'm just going to make we have a lot of people in the audience now, and if you want to participate, you're more than welcome to come sit up at the dais someplace around the table. I want to welcome everybody to this financial aid discussion. I know that we have people that are tuning in online to watch and to participate. We do have an email address if you want to submit questions. We'll gather those questions and ask them as part of the group. So if you want to send an email with your questions, feel free to do so. The email address is july26meeting@tehcb.state.tx.us. And Angela's standing by to take those. I wanted to real quickly go around for the folks that have been invited to attend. We're going to go around, and if you could click your mic on so that we can hear you. If you just real quickly introduce yourselves, and then we'll get started. And Doris, if you want to go ahead and start, we'll work around our way that way.
Doris Constantine from St. Edward's University here in Austin.
Ron Brown with University of Mary Hardin Baylor.
Marcus Wilson, Texas Tech University Health Sciences Center.
Harold White is at Texas A&M Health Science Center.
Selma DeLeon, University of North Texas.
Joe Pettibon, Texas A&M University.
Tom Malecki, University of Texas at Austin.
Lisa Blazer, University of Texas, San Antonio.
Raymond Paredes, Coordinating Board.
Arturo Alonso, Coordinating Board.
Janice Franco, Independent School District.
We'll have to get you a microphone. I'm Dan Weaver with the Coordinating Board.
I'm Jane Caldwell, Coordinating Board.
Thank you, sir.
We have many distinguished guests in the audience, and feel free, there's a podium up here with a microphone. If you feel so compelled to ask a question or participate, don't hesitate to get up and participate. Thank you for being here. This is really, the title of this is Financial Aid Discussion, which is really the intent of this is to have an open dialogue between the Coordinating Board and the financial aid community. I know that y'all are not normally shy with sharing your opinions and thoughts, and this is the kind of environment that we want to create today. The commissioner has been pondering many topics over the last few years, and I think this is an opportunity for the group to engage in this kind of a dialogue. I don't want to set too many parameters on the discussion just so that we can get started and let's see where it goes. We may want to reconvene or restructure where we're heading at midpoint, and we'll kind of play that by ear. So we're just going to turn it over to the commissioner, and Commissioner, you can make opening remarks and we'll just start the conversation.
Okay, very good. Well, I want to join Dan in thanking you for coming to this meeting. I know how busy you are during the summer. I started thinking about having this discussion, and I should underscore that this is very much a preliminary discussion. There haven't been any decisions made, but I thought after the dust settled from the legislative session that we needed to think very seriously about some major changes in the structure of state financial aid in Texas. Let me talk about the context, which I think we have to take into account. The first factor that I think is key is that most of the young people that are coming through the Texas K-12 system are poor, the public school system. By one metric or another, over 50% of students who graduate from high school are classified as being poor, which is to say they qualify for Title I, free or reduced lunches, or they have some other characteristics that designate them as being poor. Secondly, we know that we've had the largest enrollment increases in Texas on the state's history over the past couple of years. And we know that that trend is likely to continue for at least the next 2 or 3 years for predictable reasons. We know, for example, that demographically we've had a bulge in the population of young people in Texas. So we know that we have a larger population of school-age young people in Texas, or I should say it's growing faster in absolute numbers than the population of the same age of any other state. That's consideration number 2. The third is that the Texas grant program, and one can assume that that applies as well to other state financial aid programs, is not likely to grow the way it has in the past. As all of you know, we had the first cut in the Texas grant program since the inception of the program this past legislative session. We had a 10% cut, which is a lot better than what the original version of HB1 looked like, where we would not have had any money for new students. We would have only had money for renewing students. But nevertheless, although we felt a lot better at the end of the session than we did at the beginning, we did experience a cut. I think it's fair to assume that we can't expect any significant growth to the Texas grant program the next legislative session. By some estimates, we're starting off $8 billion in the hole. We have $4 billion in Medicare obligations that were essentially postponed until the next session, according to some people who watch the legislature and watch the budget. We have a $4 billion hole in the K through 12 funding program that I assume that we're going to have to take care of is our highest educational priority. The larger context at a national level, as all of you know, is that the Pell program is coming under scrutiny at the congressional level, and there have been discussions of either limiting the expansion of the Pell program or limiting the size of the stipend and making some other changes to the Pell program that will significantly affect Texas financial aid for college students. It's important to remember, as most of you know, that Texas is much more reliant on federal financial aid than virtually any other state. The breakdown nationally is about 65% of college financial aid comes from the feds, about 35% comes from the state. In Texas, it's closer to an 80-20 breakdown. So we are particularly dependent on federal financial aid for our college students. The amount of Pell money that comes into Texas dwarfs all state sources of financial aid. Well, it seems to me that we have some real challenges in front of us if we're going to be able to continue to tell our students that the state of Texas has a genuine commitment to helping young people finance their degrees and their certificates and their academic programs. We've been thinking about a lot of possibilities, and once again, nothing's been decided, and we wanted to bring in financial aid officers very early in the process to have a full discussion so that you would know exactly what we're talking about. I'm sure some of the ideas that I'm about to express will be horrifying to some of you, but the fact of the matter is we have to consider some of these possibilities. I've raised the question of putting a cap on the years for which students can receive a Texas grant, cap it at 4. I've raised the issue of changing our standard for academic progress from 12 hours a semester to 30 hours a year. Students can take 15 and 15, or they can take 12 and 6 in the summer, or they can do any combination of that. But we need to get students out sooner. we've talked about, and we've already sent you a letter about this, about putting a cap on financial, on the amount of funding we'll provide to a given student through the Texas Grant Program. I should say that one of the animating principles in these discussions is I believe that we have to be able, and there's nothing magical, this is simply my own personal view, and if you disagree, we'd like to hear from you. My own personal view is that in order for Texas Grant to be a program with real promise, we have to be able to fund 50% of eligible new students. Under the current methodology, and given the appropriated levels of funding, my understanding is we'll only be able to fund, what, about 30% of new students? Dan, is that correct?
If everybody funded. Sorry, if everybody funded at full award amounts.
Yes. Which a lot of campuses do. So I think that I tell my colleagues here that one of my fundamental philosophical principles is utilitarianism. You know, I'm a Benthamite. I believe in doing the greatest good for the greatest number. And I think that we have to, we should consider finding ways to spread the limited resources more broadly. I think it's better to give every student some form of grant eligible, worthy students, some form of a grant, and have every student in Texas that's eligible get some form of financial aid, and maybe have to take out $5, $7, even $10,000 in loans, rather than have a relative handful of students, say 30% of students, get a full award, and they will be able to get a college education without taking out a lot of loans. But the students who are, for whatever reasons, aren't able to secure a grant, a Texas grant, or some other form of Texas financial aid, end up with $25,000, $30,000 in debt. I would rather spread it out more broadly and try to help more students equitably than have essentially a lottery or raffle, and the students that get in first get the money, and those that are late get virtually nothing. We need to, something I'm very worried about, we need to make sure that the money that we provide students, to the extent that we can control it, is used for legitimate educational purposes. I tell my colleagues here, and they've heard this many times, that a recurrent nightmare I have is that a student picks up a check at a financial aid office, and some reporter follows a student to a Best Buy, and the student buys a 50-inch flat screen TV. We have to make sure that the money is used legitimately. I've had financial aid officers tell me that we should issue checks, one at the beginning of the semester, one at the beginning of the semester, one at the end of the semester, and fund partially on completion. These are ideas, once again, that have been circulated. The fundamental issue, and I'll stop here, is we have to significantly modify financial aid in Texas, given the current economic budgetary context. And that's the reason we're having this meeting. Comments?
It might be helpful if you would identify yourself before you start talking. I know that everybody's going to want to jump out there and get started. Just from additional context, we're going to present the financial aid report for fiscal year 10, so it's a little bit dated. But there were 630,000 what we determined as being basic needy students in the state of Texas in fiscal year 10. 460,000 of them are undergraduates. So to kind of put a framework or put some context within the numbers that the commissioner's talking about of the breadth of the student population that's truly a needy student population. So that's kind of the context of the discussion that we're having. Would anybody like to chime in on any of these particular topics, starting with capping Texas grant at 4 years, perhaps?
I guess I'll speak first. My name is Pilar Chanes, and I work with Brownsville Independent School District. I am the last 10 years I've been the higher ed counselor, so I help students and counselors and organize financial aid event or how students can fund and how they can transition. And we are 95% economically disadvantaged, and I think we reflect just about every district in the Valley and probably most border districts. And so for students to, if they stay locally, they don't have as much of a challenge because the Pell will take care of their tuition and they just have to worry about books. But if they have that American dream where they want to go off to school or to the flagship schools or whatever school in Texas, looking at $22,000 or $35,000 or whatever the cost is, and if it's just Pell, they have quite a difference. And you have a lot of students. I've never seen anything like this year because the students are aware of what's going on. And they are concerned how they're going to fund, and a lot of parents, especially in the Hispanic culture, are hesitant for them to get so in debt if they were to just have the Pell and have these. So it's a real issue for students. And just as it is for us, it is for the students. And I know there's no magic way we can solve this, but I know I speak for the students that they are depending on us or the people at this table to creatively come out with something that will help them in the process of making their college dream a reality.
That's precisely what I'm concerned about.
Well, if we're talking about the cap, I'm not opposed to a cap for 4 years, because if we aren't going to get any more funding and we need to spread it out a little bit more, putting a cap on that will potentially encourage them to graduate. There always needs to be exceptional circumstances. There are going to be hardships that students face. So, speaking about my population, it would be great if they all got out in 4 years, but realistically they don't. But I can certainly understand why we would need a cap.
I doubt that we would make exceptions. I think we would just say that.
This is it?
Yeah, I doubt that, because once you, it's where do you stop? I doubt that we would do that.
Okay, well, you gave us a whole list of stuff to think about, and
Harold, could you state your name, please, just for...
Harold Whitus.
Thank you.
And I understand the difficulty that you have in trying to come up with ways to spend what few funds you do have. But I just have a few observations, and my school is not the gorilla in the room. We don't have the number of students or the resources that a lot do. But these are just some general observations of mine. Anytime we target specific groups with our financial aid dollars, you tend to tie the hands of the financial aid office. I think it may be, time that financial aid directors and our offices and schools get a little bit of respect for being there with the same goal that you have, which is to help every student we can to get them through school with a minimum amount of debt and help them be successful. Not every student is going to get a top 10 scholarship. Not every student, especially after the passage of the priority model, is going to get a Texas grant. So you talk about, wanting to get every student a little bit of aid, not give aid to those who are complete their files first, but that seems to me to be a little bit of a disconnect with the funds we have, because it looks like we're trying to steer things one way, and those students who are needy, minorities who may not tend to enroll full-time, are not going to be the ones who will be able to complete get through college quickly, and have access to those funds. So it's a really tough thing to do. The only program that we really have are the set-asides, which I know are not the most popular thing. And this is just my personal opinion. I would increase the amount of money that schools provide in set-asides to allow the financial aid directors to actually have more funds that they can use in a more flexible manner to help all those students. Because as students get cut out of funds that we have, Texas grant or whatever, then that allows the financial aid office to truly look at those students. And maybe you've got a kid that didn't fill out his stuff first, or in time to get funds, but it's easier with a TPEG or a House Bill 3015 to reserve funds for those students. It's just my personal opinion that it's better to help a student with a little bit of money get his foot in the door, even if that student doesn't complete their degree. A Hispanic student who's able to tell their kids, yeah, hey, I went to college. Maybe I didn't finish, but maybe what I did get helped me prepare for some better job than I might have gotten otherwise. As you go through the generations and that kid says, Dad, did you go to college? And Dad says, yeah, I did. I didn't finish, but I want you to. It becomes important. It becomes part of his dialogue. So it's something that he'll hopefully pass on to those, future generations. And I know that's, there's set-asides aren't the most popular thing in the world, but face it, everything's a set-aside. A Pell Grant is truly a set-aside. It's your tax dollars and my tax dollars that are going to somebody else. I may not even have kids in school. I may be retired. I may not have anything to do with higher ed, but I'm still paying funds that support somebody else. So if a student complains about, part of their tuition dollars going to somebody else based on need, well, it's a reality check. Everything in life is a set-aside. So those are just some of my observations, since we're just throwing stuff out there.
I don't know what the future of set-asides will be. They came under a good deal of scrutiny this last legislative session. I suspect that will not change next session. I also suspect that as tuition and fees go up, there's going to be increasing consternation about set-asides. So I'm not sanguine about the future of set-asides.
Yeah.
Dan, do you have a different point of view, or?
Well, I don't necessarily have a different point of view, but I think set-asides from a packaging financial aid perspective offers us an insight into what you do for your students that maybe we need to look at some of your practices to see if they are replicable on a statewide basis, because set-asides really are the most flexible of financial aid. I think everybody's nodding their head in agreement of that. So I think within the set-aside, how you package set-asides, we need to glean some of those best practices and perhaps apply them to other state programs. So I think that's part of our, I'd like to come back to the set-asides because I think it's germane to the rest of our conversation today. But I don't want to get too far afield from some of the specific Texas grant issues. I like to kind of get some other feedback from other folks. So I'm not dismissing you, Harold. Maybe later. Okay.
You'll dismiss me later.
I'll dismiss you later.
Ron Brown with the University of Maryland Baylor. What would maybe be helpful, at least in my office, in a smaller operation where you have 3,000 students and you're trying to keep up with it, and I'm assuming one day we'll all have one big state grant program. When I say this, because I'm with a private school, so I don't have a dog in the fight on the Texas grants. But an aggregate limit would be, I think, easier for us to all keep up with. Right now, we're used to keeping up with an aggregate limit of $23,000 on subsidized loans, and you can transfer from institution A to institution B to institution C, and it's still $23,000 is all you're going to have in subsidized student loans. We're all used to looking at a common place that the coordinating board could provide so that we wouldn't go over. I think saying we're going to help for 8 full-time semesters and no more could be a real hardship on all of us as people are transferring around and going in and out of places to know exactly what semester they're in, because you're going to be needing to cut some people at Christmas time, cut some other people in May, and keeping up with summer school attendance, to throw that in the mix when you're looking at it. It just seems like if you want to do $7,100 for a Texas grant or a Be On Time loan, say you've got a $28,000 aggregate limit on a Texas grant and no one's going to receive more than that. Or if you want to stretch the dollar further, say you have a $25,000 or a $20,000 aggregate limit on Texas grant. But I think it would be easier for us to all implement if it were looked at as an aggregate limit rather than as cumulative semesters.
Thank you.
This is Jane Caldwell. We have a significant challenge in tracking the use of the 150 hours for Texas grants and the number of semesters. And then TEOG has a different 75-hour limit in 4 years, and TEG doesn't have an hour limit but a time limit. And we have such a mobile population now at the institutions, it is a very difficult thing for the colleges and for us to keep track of student eligibility. That sounds like a great idea.
Would it be easier? How would it be easier, and I'm just trying to understand, to track the aggregate amount than to track the semester hours? I mean, they're still going to be moving around.
The coordinating board could have available to us the site where we can see what has been drawn down under that student's Social Security number, and then we would know they're $18,000 on their way to $25,000. They have $7,000 more in Texas grant, and they're transferring to me after attending a community college or after being at another 4-year university and now coming to mine.
So it would be centrally tracked then,
right? Like the subsidized loan program is, where we keep up with our limit, because we all go to a national data system and we can see what's this student borrowed in the past, and so where are we on our way to $23,000, and we can work it out to the dollar and can't go over $23,000.
Right. Thank you.
So we have something similar to that currently in place for TEOG and Texas grant. So that wouldn't be too far. That's not a very large stretch.
Yeah.
Tom, you got
that? Doesn't sound.
Tom Alecki. I would make one cautionary note about aggregate limits on Texas grants. An aggregate limit, it seems to me, also implies an aggregate commitment. And in a program that's funded by appropriations every 2 years, I'm not sure that's a commitment, as you just suggested, Commissioner. That's a commitment that students could necessarily count on if appropriations are cut. The fundamental difference between the Texas grant program and the subsidized direct loan program is the government has committed it will provide direct loan funding up to $23,000 for the students. And that occurs, assuming there's no debt meltdown in Washington, that occurs no matter how much Congress is willing to appropriate for the program. Just a couple questions, Commissioner. On the 4-year cap, and I understand your concern about making exceptions, but is it really a 4-year cap, or is it a cap tied to the number of years that we would expect a student carrying, say, 15 hours a semester to complete their bachelor's degree? Because at institutions like mine and say Texas A&M, where we have engineering schools, I don't know how I go to my dean of engineering and say we're going to have to cut off your engineers in their last year from their Texas grants. I assume we'd want to somehow peg that to the length of the program.
I don't know. That's something we'd have to take into account.
It is something, it would seem to me that it might be worth taking into account, because it seems to me that the students got the finish line in sight, and if we have to pull their grant, a major portion of their grant funding in that year, that might really undermine the needy students' ability to complete their program.
Well, the other possibility is we're going to ask institutions to look and streamline their academic programs. There's some precedent for that.
Well, that's fine, and as soon as you achieve that, then I think we should go to 4-year limits. As soon as you absolutely achieve that across the board at all institutions.
Yeah, and I'm sure that notion will alarm some people who are listening to this. But the point I'm making, I'm not suggesting we're going to go ahead and do it just with a meat cleaver. I'm suggesting that we are living in an era when we have to. I keep using this phrase over and over again. We have to reinvent public higher education. And so I think we have to look at every possibility. I know, for example, that in the UT system, that the medical programs are being shortened, the UT system is looking for ways to accelerate progress towards degrees. So it may well be that there will be degree programs, 5-year degree programs that will be examined and modified to fit a 4-year frame. I don't know. We'll look at it, but I'm certainly aware that there are 5-year programs. But I'm saying that maybe the best solution is not to extend eligibility for the Texas Grant Program, but rather try to shrink 5-year degree programs to 4 years when it's possible.
I don't have any particular issue, at least at the top level, on any of the things that have really been suggested. By the way, Joe Pettibon, Texas A&M. The concern on capping at 4 years is more of a, how do you deal with part-time students who are in the program? So is it a 4-year cap for them, or is it the equivalent of a 4-year cap for them? So if they're only enrolled half-time, or does it become a program that then incentivizes students to be full-time? It can go either way, but then does 4 years become 8 years if they're a half-time student the whole time? That kind of question. Length of program, as Tom raised, I share the same concern. If you have a program that takes 132 hours, does that give you one more semester of eligibility, and it's a 4.5-year cap? With regard to, my preference is actually on a length of time cap, a 4-year cap, as opposed to an aggregate dollar amount. And I say that from the standpoint of we are, in many respects, as a result of where the budget went this year, moving away from things like maximum Texas grant awards to our students at the full $7,100 this year. We're doing lower dollar amounts in order to spread the money more broadly. Having an aggregate, I think, does give some level of indication to a student, hey, I might be eligible for more money, but we don't want to necessarily give somebody more money if they've already hit 4 years. So I'm not quite as big of a proponent of an aggregate dollar limit. I would rather see a length of time limit. We talk about the cap of Texas grant at 4 years. The implication is that's at a 4-year institution. An institution, a community college that also is awarding Texas grant probably should have a 2-year limit, or whatever the equivalent is, with perhaps some sort of incentive to encourage transfer as well. There's money saved as a result of the student going to a community college in the financial aid programs. Should perhaps a student who then is transferring get a bonus from those savings, so to speak? I realize that spends more money in some respects, but one of the goals we should have is trying to encourage students, particularly low-income students that are starting at community colleges, to transfer to 4-year institutions. One of the areas.
Let me just respond to something that we need to really look at data. We worry a lot about part-time students, but I'm wondering if our financial aid policies encourage educational practices among students that don't help them. I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago where we looked at national data that the ultimate graduation rates for part-time students nationally is 15%.
Yeah, it's poor.
Huh?
It's very poor.
with limited dollars, is that a reasonable investment? We're talking about triage here, folks.
Yeah. Well, and that's where my comment is related to. I mean, Texas Grant could become, and you could say it is a program that incentivizes students to be full-time, as opposed to a program that is trying to help part-time students. Now, I say that where my campus is 90+% full-time students, so I recognize it's not the students on my campus we're talking about by and large. The other comment I would make is many of us, from a financial aid office standpoint, have argued that it doesn't make a whole lot of sense that we're giving Texas Grant to students who with a 4,000 EFC or less as a freshman, and then turning around and potentially giving a student with the $10,000, $12,000 EFC as a renewal student, because we don't have any type of checks or caps in place on renewals. And that is, to me, what I would argue is a low-hanging fruit in terms of savings.
That's a very good point.
To where, and I'm not saying we want to take that person perhaps completely out of the program. Maybe we do, maybe we don't. But maybe instead of a full Texas Grant, they're given them a maximum of $1,000, or they're taken out of the program altogether, depending on how you want to try to manage that student and the expectations. The other piece of that, though, is as soon as you give that kid a Texas Grant, the current statute kicks in that says we got to cover tuition and fees, and that becomes problematic.
Sorry, this is Dan Weaver again. How do you fund a 15-15 student as opposed to a 12-12 and 6?
No, I wouldn't fund them any different. I would fund them on my campus. I would say the student's got to complete 30 hours in the year. I'm funding fall and spring. If they're choosing to take summer, they may have to borrow to take summer. They may have to rely on institutional aid. But I'm expecting them to complete 30 by the end of the year. They may do that 12, and then 6 at another campus, but they got to complete 30.
Everybody else?
This is Lisa Blazer from UT San Antonio. We have a new scholarship program, and that's exactly what we did. They have to be full-time to get it, but they need to complete 30 hours. So I only fund them for the fall and spring. So if they take 15 hours, they're covered, and it's a substantial scholarship. And then during the summer, if they take 12 and 12, they got to take 6 during the summer, or they don't get renewed for the scholarship the next year. So the 30-hour limit, as long as they do have the summer to do that, I would still only fund them for fall, spring, because that's where the higher cost is. They would only have to take 6 hours during the summer, and they could get other resources to do that. So,
Tom?
I would agree with that.
Tom Malecki, UT Austin. I think there's some merit to looking at upping the number of hours that students have to complete to renew their Texas grants. I do think we have to be careful about some unintended consequences. For example, Commissioner, I appreciate what you're saying about the possibility of students using a Texas grant to go out and buy the big screen TV. I don't know that that's a very common practice. In fact, I would suggest it's a very uncommon practice. And I think if we have to be careful about the concept of funding at both the student at both the beginning and the end of the semester, because the student has ongoing costs throughout the semester that they have to meet, and how do they finance those costs while they're waiting for their Texas grant to come in. One way, of course, could be for the student to finance them with short-term debt in our institutional capacities to make short-term loans to students are somewhat limited. That means that students may turn to much more expensive forms of other types of debt, or they may turn to working, and while working has some distinct advantages, working a reasonable number of hours while carrying a full load, we do know that students who tend to work beyond about 15 hours a week while trying to carry a full load tend to suffer higher degrees of attrition, have more grade problems, and quite frankly, they may be more inclined to drop courses during the semester. And so in a sense, the solution that we would be seeking might be defeated by the means we put in place to try to achieve that solution. So I think we might have to be a little bit careful about that. I do think that if we're talking about folks carrying 30 hours a semester, I can be pretty much assure you that they're not going to have a lot of time to watch any kind of a TV, much less a big screen.
Well, that's I don't know if you've read the book Academically Adrift, but they looked at what is it, the NESE data that show that students study much less now than they did 10, 15 years ago. A minimum of 10 hours a week less. And one of the questions that's raised by that book, and I'm not suggesting the book is definitive, I'm suggesting that we need to challenge some of these assumptions that we've made for years about the behavior of college students. There's a lot of evidence that students who work, as you put it, more than 15 hours a week, that the reason their grades suffer is not because of the burden of the work, but it's because the culture of students in higher education has changed, and they simply aren't willing to work as hard in terms of their academics. So that's. I'm not once again. I'm not suggesting that's definitive. I'm suggesting there's another. There's another way to examine and reach some conclusions about that issue.
Yeah, I've looked at some of those data before, Commissioner, and part of what we've some of the federal data have shown is that the more hours a week students work, the more they report that they have difficulty accessing, for example, the library, which is the one service on campus that's probably open the most to the students. The more difficulty they have getting the classes that they're trying to get for the sequences that they're trying to complete, the more difficulty they have getting in to see their faculty members during office hours and or accessing other forms of academic support. So again, I think you're right. It's not definitive. It is a mixed bag. And again, I just think we have to be a little bit careful about crafting solutions that might for a lot of students be injurious.
I completely agree with that. I completely agree.
I was just going to comment on. Comment on the issue of the issuing of checks, because I agree. The idea of issuing one at the beginning, one at the end of a semester, is going to be problematic for the student who's relying on that to pay actual costs and expenses during the course of that semester. I say that then with the understanding that I recently ran across a study that was done that was showing that if you pay out financial aid in some cases on a monthly basis, almost as a stipend to the student, almost like a paycheck, that it helps the student better manage their finances and ultimately helps them in terms of being able to progress. That being said, the challenge is Texas Grant is one piece of a very large puzzle, and it is a significant piece. But unless it's done for the financial aid programs as a whole, it becomes a whole lot less effective and a whole lot more difficult to manage if we're treating just one program that particular way versus trying to treat the financial aid programs as a whole that way. And we can't do it on the federal level without the student's permission to do it, because it's their choice of how that money then is delivered to them.
Marcus Wilson, Texas Tech University Health Sciences Center. Does the data suggest that these considerations that have kind of been thrown out, the impact that it will have on the populations, is it taking away students that we're trying to have an impact on so that the ones are left would be the ones that would be going through college anyway, whether this program were in place or not?
I guess that would be something we would have to look at.
Janice.
Okay.
I think districts and the state really want everyone to get a post-secondary opportunity. For some students, it's a technical. Not everyone's going to go to a four-year institution, and those students will technically be taken care of through their Pell Grant. In other words, they'll have the money to go. The students that are part-time students are students probably that have other responsibilities. They have to work, they have children. Sometimes they don't do well because of SAP, and then the students have to stay out, put money together, go back to school. They have different issues. But I think the students that we're trying to target here with Texas Grant are those students that really have that drive to finish a 4-year. And so I know it becomes a challenge because what do you balance? How do you do it? But those students have every intention. The recipients of the Texas Grant have for most part, will have that serious intent of finishing their 4-year education. Or in some cases, it might take 5, just because that's what the program demands. But it's just sort of difficult to come up with a perfect solution, I know.
Can I real briefly, financial aid typically starts with cost of attendance and kind of works backwards to fill up the student's need. We're having discussions around grant aid in excess of academic charges, essentially. And at what point, and I know there's a need for grant aid beyond academic charges, but we tend to get into discussions here of, well, where, at what point does when does state aid, how far does state aid need to go to cover academic charges, and what part of state aid should or should not go towards paying for living expenses? I'm just going to throw that one out there.
This is Lisa Blazer from UT San Antonio. I'm not sure what the answer is to that question because, I changed the way I was awarding Texas Grant this year to make sure I covered tuition and fees and looked at other resources for students living on or off campus, still with limitations. Only because of limited funding. I looked at last year. Some of my returning students are not so happy with me because last year, if they were full Pell and full Texas Grant, they got around and plus ACG, that was another benefit. They got about $13,000 in grants. This year, they're getting $8,800 to cover 15 hours of tuition and fees. So they're a little bit upset with me. But I feel compelled that if there's limited funding and I still need to cover at least 50% of my new students, I needed to limit it somewhere. And as long as we're guaranteeing the tuition and fees, they're covered. And then I look for other resources. But bottom line, if you look at a freshman student coming in, and if I give them their tuition and fees, their Stafford loans will not cover their room and board. They would have to borrow additional Parent Plus loan, which a lot of my students, their parents can't get a Plus loan, so they get denied the Parent Plus loan. Then they take out more unsubsidized Stafford loans, and pretty soon all those Staffords are going to be unsubsidized anyway. They're all unsubsidized. They're taking out more and more loans every year. So I understand the concept of spreading it out over more students to reduce loan debt. But I am spreading it out, and they're still taking out loan debt. I'm having to look at that other resource that I have because it's limited for the next couple of years, and I'm having to take the cost of room and board minus what they're eligible for student loans, minus any other scholarships, exemptions, waivers, anything that they're getting, and then if they still have eligibility, up to a cap for what I'm calling a room and board grant. So I think I think state aid may need to help with those room and board charges. The other thing I would caution against, I understand the concern about making sure that money is used for legitimate educational purposes. It's a few outliers that do the wrong thing. The majority of our students need those funds, and they have to pay rent, and their bill is due. Even on campus, I have to convince our on-campus housing, okay, their financial aid's coming, it'll be okay. So and then I have a lot of commuter students living in apartments, that are on the outskirts of campus, and we have to go through special measures if they don't have their financial aid in time. If we made them wait until the end of the semester, and most of their living expense checks are not coming from Texas Grant and Pell, it's coming from student loans. So that's where if we limited the Texas grants, that means they're borrowing more student loans, and so that I think that would put a hardship on the students. And I don't want us to set a policy for legitimate educational purposes when we only have a few students that are abusing the system, and eventually they get caught. So just my take on that.
Let me respond to that. I wasn't suggesting that there is a large number of students who inappropriately use grant money. My question really had to do, are we performing all the due diligence that we should? And are there ways that we can monitor the funds in a way that's not onerous, but yet does help us say with a little bit more confidence that the money is being used appropriately? Because I was not suggesting that this happens a lot. I was suggesting that there are people that are very concerned about how much money we spend on state financial aid, and it would take simply one incident to turn this thing into a major issue. And I'd want to be able to say with assurance, as Commissioner of Higher Education, that our financial aid officers and offices are doing all they can to make sure the money is being used appropriately. That was really my point. I don't believe for a moment that inappropriate use of the money is a rampant issue.
Right. I think we just have to be, and I understand that. I think we have to be careful based on that potential one incident of somebody doing that we don't set some other kind of reporting mechanism or issue in the financial aid office to compensate for what might happen.
No,
I think the cost of attendance does allow us to do that. Setting a cap on the Texas grant, suggesting that you only award $5,000, for most of the four-year institutions, that's not going to be that much over tuition and fees, even if you award $5,000 plus $5,550 in Pell. So based on the fact that living on campus, the expenses are high, I don't think we're going to see that. So we just have to be careful that we don't set some kind of extra reporting process in place to make sure that no state aid goes towards, it would be really hard for us to do that. But I understand the concern. I certainly do.
This is Zelma DeLeon with the University of North Texas, and I agree with what Lisa's saying because we are seeing the same thing. Our freshman students are required to live on campus, and they are barely able to pay with student loans and not have any money left over for expenses throughout the rest of the year.
Oh, sorry. So back to award amount rather than full award for Texas grants, and I know that the private schools within the TEG program have a lot more flexibility on how much they award for TEG. We've kind of ventured off into less than full awards for Texas grant. This year, during the interim session, I suspect that we'll have committees that will meet and we'll hash through what we should be looking at for the next session. Could we just have a little brief discussion about Texas grant awards that are no longer full Texas grant awards, and is that a positive or negative from y'all's opinion?
Well, one of the things that I would argue is the premise of the Texas grant program was to ensure that a student who's receiving Texas grant has their tuition and fees met by scholarships and grants. And to that point, with the lower dollar amounts that many institutions are using, we are still meeting what the Texas grant program was intended to do. So the lower dollar amounts to me is not necessarily a problem. The flexibility that institutions have to do that has been helpful in terms of being able to figure out how do we best manage that with the population of students we have on our campus, and where do we want to see those dollars go in terms of the students. So I think the flexible dollar amount and the flexibility in the Texas grant program that was introduced it really has been there for a while, but really emphasized this year with the budget situation, is a tremendous value to helping us help students and being able to move the money around. So, but I would argue we're still doing exactly what the Texas grant program was intended. We're still ensuring that students' tuition and fees are covered.
Tom Malecki, and I would agree with Joe. Going back to the one point that was made earlier, and forgive me, I don't have the figures in front of me, I don't recall, but I know we did have to designate more of our tuition set-aside money for this year to help provide a match up to tuition for Texas grant and Pell and such than we have in past years. And so in making good on that promise to cover tuition, again, it actually makes that set aside somewhat more important to us in order to fulfill the mission of the Texas grant program.
But ultimately, those funds would have normally gone to what other type of student? You're just taking money from one student's pocket and putting it into a different student's pocket. Is that fair?
Yes. I'm in a little bit different situation because we talked about this yesterday with the UT system schools. I agree with Joe. The flexibility that we have this year, that was emphasized more this year, has really helped us spread the money out a little bit further. Again, students may not be completely happy with it, but it allowed me to spread out the funds. I didn't have to use as much of my set-aside, my TPEG set-aside, because I chose to just cover tuition and fees as opposed to doing a $5,000 grant. So that seemed to work very well for us this year. But I serve a completely different population. I have a lot of Pell-eligible students, so the majority of my students, I covered a big chunk of our students with Pell and Texas Grant. There were only a few that the $7,100 Texas Grant didn't cover, and I had to cover a few $100s. And I do think that we do need to really look at our returning students. It becomes increasingly more difficult, and we will have to use more set-asides if we continue for renewal students. If we're going to set a 4,000 EFC, there has to be a limit for renewal students, because that makes it increasingly difficult if they're going to still be part of the Texas Grant Program. Our UTSA Access, the tuition guarantee program, they still have to have a $30,000 income every year. So if they fall out of that, they're no longer part of the Access program because it's for the neediest students. And if Texas Grant's going to be for the neediest and now the priority group, I think we need to set some kind of limitation, because if you're looking at somebody with a $15,000 EFC, over the years, for some reason it changes, then should they really be getting the Texas Grant that's designated for the neediest students? That's something to think about.
Set aside keeps coming up, and I want to make very clear. Is that better? Oh, are you finished? Oh, okay. The fact that I'm at a health profession school, a large portion of our population are graduate professional. They don't get Texas grants. So anytime I hear that the set-asides are kind of becoming a target, maybe to collapse into other programs, that's really taking my only grant program away from all of my students. So we get real sensitive there that you're taking the only programs that my kids have to give to a student at a different university. I'm sure they're real needy, but my kids are thinking they're needy too. Let me back up a tiny little bit. Again, at a health profession school, most of our programs, or a significant number of our programs, are 2+2, 2+3, 3+2. So my kids are being cut off on Texas Grant long before they get to the 4th year. So these programs that are 5-year, that's neat. They get 4 years taken care of. That 5th year's on their own. The professions that these 5-year programs are, chances are those kids are going to be making good money, and if they only have to borrow a larger portion that last year, my kids are doing it for 2 or 3 years. So that's just another opinion there.
We're probably halfway point. Harold, have we talked about set-asides enough, or do you want to come back and talk about set-asides?
No, you're finally getting back around to it. So.
I love set-asides, by the way. I do want to make a little bit of a transition and talk about 2+2 strategies. And Commissioner, that's going to be your lead in, unless you want me to say something else, trying to figure out ways to integrate our state financial aid strategies to encourage students to enroll at community college, transfer to a 4-year institution, and have seamless financial aid from a state's perspective. And I don't know if you want to say something about 2+2.
Yeah, I think it's very clear that for a lot of reasons, not the least of which is the continuing rise in the cost of tuition fees at universities relative to the cost of community colleges, that more students, including high-achieving students, are opting to start off in community colleges. There was an article in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago that I'm sure a number of you saw, that community colleges are now attracting very capable students who could get into some of the more selective universities in the country, and they're deciding to go to community colleges just to hold down the cost of their credentials or degrees. In Texas, we're seeing this very dramatically. And our financial aid system was not built on the notion of students very consciously determining to go to 2 years of community college or to accumulate 2 years of college credit in two-year institutions and then transferring to universities for the last 2 years of college credit towards a baccalaureate. I feel very strongly that we need to revise our financial aid policies and practices in Texas in a way that recognize that that's increasingly the norm here in Texas. There are a lot of states, for example, that have done this quite well. I think we should take a look at those practices. I think we might at some point develop, maybe sooner rather than later, dual admission programs. We have some version of those at some institutions already, and tell students that if you start off in a community college and you go to a university that has an articulation agreement with that community college, then we will guarantee you financial aid to cover X percentage of the cost of attendance, maybe it's tuition and fees. But I think we need to consciously develop programs like that. A couple of you have already mentioned already that the way the Texas Grant Program is set up, students that have a particular academic trajectory simply aren't eligible for Texas grants. So that's something we need to take a look at. If you have any ideas, Joe, probably you have some ideas given your location.
One of the things that's interesting, I've actually for several years now have talked about the need to open Texas Grant up for transfer students, because it just simply doesn't work the way it is structured. The requirement to either have Texas Grant at the community college or an associate's degree is just not the reality of who's transferring. Yeah. They're transferring before they get the associate's degree. And I realize that's somewhat of a disincentive for the community college because they want the associate's degree to be able to count as a completer and that type of thing. But we got to find a way to open up Texas Grant to transfer students. And I would argue, and I referenced it a little bit earlier, I would argue that because it does save the state money on financial aid programs, there ought to be some incentive to that student when they do transfer that they're getting a slightly more a slightly larger portion of Texas Grant their junior and senior year when they're actually at a four-year institution. We have a very good program, the Blend Team program that the commissioner references, and we handle the financial aid on our campus for that program, in part because it provides greater incentives and greater resources to the student because they're part of our campus and then can have access to the scholarship programs on our campus and things like that as well. But I've argued for many years that we're not doing any service to transfer students in the Texas Grant program. We simply are cutting that program off from them because the reality is they're not earning the associate's degree and the funding is too limited for us to have a whole lot of Texas Grant students transferring.
Dr. Paredes, there may be some unintended consequences, though, for a push on the 2+2. You mentioned the statistic earlier about 15% of all those students that attend part-time don't complete. Well, a lot of those students that attend part-time are those students who go into community colleges, and they don't complete because of the things that draw their focus away from going to school, such as home and family and work and things like that. There are other studies that will tell you that students that go to a four-year school first actually have a higher completion rate than those who started at community college. So that's, it may be a great thing, may not. It may save money, but it may not increase the actual rate of completion.
Well, I think Joe and I are saying something different. I think we're simply trying to respond to the reality of educational patterns that is increasing in Texas and around the country. We know the data that suggests that students who start out at universities have much higher completion rates than students who start out at community colleges. That's to a large extent a function that most universities have admission standards and community colleges are open admissions. That's one factor, but we're talking about the students who go to community colleges who are fully capable of doing university work, who do in many aspects resemble university students, but they start out at community colleges simply because of the reduced cost. We see it in particular places all over the state. For example, El Paso. It's very clear if you look at the growth of El Paso Community College. It's very clear that a lot of students have decided that their goal is to get a baccalaureate degree at UTEP, but they're going to do their first 2 years of credit at El Paso Community College, and they have a wonderful cooperative arrangement there. I'm talking about the students who are intent on getting a baccalaureates. Typically attend full time, typically are relatively high achieving, and that's why I say we might build this around these 2+2 strategies. At least in the beginning, they might be built around dual admission strategies.
Yeah, I would go back then and talk more about set-asides, because encouraging students to go full-time, at the Texas Grant Program, you have to complete 24 hours in a year. If the student population unique to your university is not doing that, then those funds are, they're helping some schools where that's the norm, but other schools where it's not, that's not helping them much. Things like the set-asides are the tool that a lot of community colleges, other schools have to encourage students to go full-time.
One of the...
Go ahead. Pilar Janice. I know that in our area, the University of Texas at Brownsville offers a competitive full scholarship to top 10% students, and they give them full tuition for 4 years. They give them their books, and they also give them room and board. And so some of the students choose to stay a couple of years because for their parents it means that they have to contribute zero. Yet when they're ready to transfer to a flagship, they want to go to UT or A&M, for their junior year, and these are top students. Basically, they're probably they're not gonna be able to take anything because they don't get a Texas grant through them. They just, they're taken care of through Pell and the university. So there are some students that have that challenge, exactly what he's talking about.
Our first visit from the audience. If you could state your name.
Henry Garcia, Delmar College, Corpus Christi. Regarding the 2+2 program, if we open the opportunity to TEOG recipients to stay 2 years with us and then transfer and then get the opportunity to become a Texas grant recipient at the university level, I think that will be an incentive for our students. Also get them out the door a little quicker too.
So regardless of their, if they complete 30 hours, for instance, as opposed to an associate's degree, as a TEOG recipient?
If they have the admission requirements for the university and they want to transfer after 2 years, whether they have 50 hours or 60 hours, but they get admitted to the university, give them the opportunity to get a Texas grant.
Pilar Janice. I also forgot to say that we have a different segment of students right now. A lot of the districts have early college high schools that the students are finishing with an associate's degree. Just came from a meeting last month with Alma Garcia, the Texas High School Project, through the Gates program. And so where they're heading is that they want all of the high schools, and in all of our high schools in our district are also heading that most of the students will graduate, if not with the associates, pretty close with that. And so some students, because they take the dual enrollment with the local college, actually transition the first year there, the familiarity of it, but then they stay there maybe 1 year or complete their hours, and then they're ready to move. And so they're in, again, that same situation. They stayed, might have not received the Texas grant, and so that's another segment of students.
We have financial disincentives currently built into state financial aid for students that transfer from a community college to a four-year institution. So is it sufficient financial incentive to assure them of some amount of Texas grant? Or is there something else that we need to do, keeping in mind that there are renewal requirements for Texas grant, just like there are for TEG, to maintain the continuing of the program?
I think part of the challenge is there, what you just said, to guarantee. With the current budget situation, I don't know that we can guarantee a whole lot. But opening the door that allows us to give that student money to be eligible for the program, to me is a huge first step. The other aspect, so one of the things that we inherently have in the Texas grant program with the recommended curriculum and now with the priority model coming up in 2 years is a merit component to this. So how does that factor into a student who transfers? I would argue it's not simply that they got admitted, it's a completion of 30 hours in a 3.0 or they've completed a certain set of courses or there's some other mechanism to determine who are the people who are most likely to be successful when they do transfer, incentivize that population. And so that's what I'm talking about in terms of the Texas grant for transfer.
And you could use the SAP standards that we currently have to, if they went to a community college and maybe part of a 2+2 program, then at the end of that 2 years, whether they got the associate's degree or not, if they met the requirements for a student after their second year for Texas grant, then they could be put into the pipeline. Again, there is no way for us to do a guarantee with limited funding. They're going to be put into the pipeline just like new students. We have to be careful that some of us serve more transfer students than others. So we can't really say, oh, you have to serve this percentage of transfer, this percentage of new students. I think that's going to have to be a flexible opportunity at the institutions depending on who they serve. But I do think that you could use some of the SAP standards if those change to the 30-hour requirement, because those are the students that aren't going part-time, that potentially may not stop out, they may continue. So that's something to think about if you're looking at coming up with a criteria for us to look at to put them into the pipeline for Texas grant.
So I'm trying to weave Mr. Johnson, Dr. Johnson from UNT Enrollment has a couple questions, and I'm trying to get them to fit in, and I think this might be a good place. So from a Texas grant award amount, talking about incentives and disincentives, is there a dollar amount that makes sense that $2,500, $1,500, $5,000 at a four-year institution? Is there what's the sweet spot? And this is kind of back to set-asides, Harold, is what is the financial incentive package for students that encourages them to enroll and retain and persist and graduate? I'm looking for the magic bullet here.
And I would argue there's not one.
Is it $5,000?
Well, so I would argue that any program to create an incentive over the long term has to be a significant commitment of dollars. But is the right answer $5,000? Is the right answer $2,000? Well, it depends on the financial situation of the student who's actually getting the money and what other type of financial aid that they're receiving. If they're a full Pell eligible student, then it may be $4,000. If they're a student who's getting $1,000 of Pell and doesn't have any other financial aid, it may be $6,000. I think it varies depending on the individual student as to where you're trying to go, and that's why I think one of the keys, and I would argue one of the successes of Texas grant has been the argument that it covers tuition and fees if you get that program. The hard part of that is as the money gets tightened and there's less money, it becomes more difficult for institutions to do that if the state's not providing the bulk of the money in order to make that happen. But I think the right answer, the magic sweet spot, is to say tuition and fees is being paid.
From some form of gift aid.
Correct.
Not necessarily from state aid or from federal aid.
The combination of all
combination
of those things,
of gift
right.
aid.
And then I think the incentive in some respects, should be on top of that. I mean, if you're talking about, somebody who's transferring and you want to provide an incentive, we're going to cover tuition and fees in your books in this case. And I don't want to tie it to books. Please don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying we want to say how much is your books, we'll give you that dollar amount. I'm saying it's $1,000 for books, not, it's a fixed dollar amount, not we got to go figure out what you're charging.
I guess one other question that Troy had was looking at community college, if there's any discussion about changing the number of hours required to get an associate's degree. Would it be shortened at all? This is probably a question for the commissioner, or maybe a to be determined.
I don't have any view on that. I don't think we've looked at that issue enough to make a judgment.
But if the requirement to have an associate degree goes away, does that make that question a little bit more moot? Or is that the reason for the question, is trying to help these kids into the pipeline?
Perhaps I should read his question, might make it better. Proposed legislative initiative this session was to limit associate's degrees to 60 hours. This would seem in sync with the commissioner's philosophy for both streamlined academic programs and four-year Texas grants, especially as they would work well for transfer-bound students. What is the likelihood that degree plans at the associate degree level will be shortened as they have been at bachelor's degree level in such a way as to maximize a four-year Texas grant cap? That was the question. We are at 10:20. I think one thing I'd like to kind of throw out, because we're at the beginning of the next semester, we're looking at allocations for fiscal year 13. Don't get too excited. It gets back to award amounts and number of students that have been, how many awards are we currently making in this current academic year, looking at kind of what our targets are for award amounts for next year. And because we're oft criticized for being late to the game on these types of issues, I felt like today would be a good time to talk about fiscal year 13, if anybody wants to jump in on that one.
Could you help us understand the coordinating board's methodology for making allocations for fiscal year 12?
It was actually quite simple. We tried to assess the number of renewal students at each particular campus, and we marry that to the number of renewal students we expect on a statewide basis, and those two numbers don't always mesh because we don't know exactly where students will enroll as renewal students. Essentially, we took the number of renewal students we estimated on each particular campus, and then we applied a best guess factor of what's the likely occurrence of that happening at that particular campus based on last year's history, 3 years ago running average, a 50-50 blend of the two, and we gave everybody the most advantageous renewal count that we could come up with. So each particular campus, and it fluctuates wildly from year to year. So just to let you know, we gave everybody $5,000. We spent all of our renewal monies essentially in that manner, and then we took what was left and distributed based on the number of students on each particular campus with an EFC less than 4,000, in the same manner that we've done Texas Grant for many, many years at a $5,000 award amount. The issue that I'm expecting that you're going to ask about next is that you have more renewal students than you got allocation for this year. So high renewal student campuses at times $5,000 adds up to less money than you got this year, which Joe and you and a couple of other institutions would be in that same boat. When you fund students, the dollars flow with wherever the students are, and at a $5,000 amount, that's how those monies were distributed. If you take them times 7,100, clearly institutions with high renewal populations would have gotten more renewal funds at the expense of other students across the state.
Yeah, we took despite a 9% reduction in Texas grant funding for the coming biennium, we took a 32% hit on our Texas grant funding for this coming year. And one of the things I'm mindful of is that SB 28 is going to tie at least allocations for initial Texas grant funding to the institution's prior share of initial funding. So my question is, how are you going to play that through in order to conform to SB 28's requirements? Because when you look at, I think one of the impacts of what you did this year was it tended to have an impact then on the institution's ability, not only, we were able to fund our renewal students, and as a matter of fact, at our institution, fund them at the amount that you recommended, $5,000 apiece. It did have an impact, though, on our ability to provide Texas grant funding to new students coming in. And I'm wondering how that's all going to play out. It seems to me that we could be engaging in a practice that is going to undermine the ability of some of the institutions that tend to have the highest Texas grant graduation rates in terms of their ability to attract and actually make themselves affordable to new students once the new priority bill's allocation formula sets in.
Well, the allocation for SB 28 is there is no change in the allocation based on the priority portion of SB 28.
Right, but there is a provision in the bill that says that the institution's share of initial Texas grant funding for any given year is tied to its share of initial Texas grant funding in the prior year, which means that when that kicks in for fiscal year 14, somehow my fear is it may tie back to fiscal year 13 funding or allocations. So, you asked about fiscal year 13. I'm wondering if we need to think beyond fiscal year 13 and even think down the road a little further.
So you're suggesting that instead of $5,000 awards, you might make $2,500 awards in order to boost your initial student capacity? I'm not sure I completely understand maybe what your question is.
My institution has almost twice the statewide average of Texas grant graduation rates. Why is it we took a 32% hit this past year? Are we likely to take have the same kind of allocation next year? And if what we're trying to do is use Texas grant not only to bring needy and deserving students to campus, but also to help them graduate, how are we supposed to do that at the institutions that tend to have the best graduation performances?
I guess I'll go backwards. The difference between 5,000 and 7,100 is a 29% reduction. So the reason institutions with high renewal rate students got a larger reduction just by the fact that the award amount went from 7,100 to 5,000. It didn't have anything to do with your student population. It had everything to do with the award amount.
So did all universities across the state take a 29% reduction?
If you look at it on a student basis, Every institution, their average student count went down from 7,100 to 5,000, which is 29% reduction.
But I have over 2,000 Texas grant eligible new students, even among those who chose to come, even though we weren't able to put any state aid into their initial financial aid package. I'm not able to fund, I'm lucky if I'm able to fund half of those.
And
at by the way, 5,000 apiece. I could drop them to 2,500 apiece, but quite frankly, I'm not sure that's going to necessarily make sure that they're able to afford their first year at UT Austin.
Well, I guess
and by the way, UT Austin is an institution whose tuition increase this past year was half the national average and below the state average for public four-year institutions. So it's not like we're using Texas Grant to fund a mammoth increase in tuition into our institution. We're trying to hold the line on costs, and I think doing a fairly decent job of it when it comes to cost for students. And but we tend to have a high Texas Grant graduation rate, and we get less money to give to students who come there that can help boost graduation rates in the Texas Grant program and help close the gap when it comes to graduation in this state.
Let me suggest that we do this. We've only got half an hour left. I don't want to get bogged down talking about individual institutions' issues. Those are, from what I've heard, these are legitimate issues, and I'd like to talk about them. And
I would too.
And I'd like to find out what the resolution is. But let's not do it in a forum where we're trying to talk about broad financial aid policy.
My point, though, my broad point would be that I think we need to take some other factors into account besides just what it might take to give every renewal student $5,000. Because I'm not sure that we're taking some of the other factors into account that it would seem to me that a state that's trying to implement a priority system needs to take into account.
So this is a short segue. I've been at the coordinating board for a few years now, and the biggest source of angst for me is trying to determine allocations for institutions on financial aid.
Yeah, I don't envy you that.
Well, so let's talk about more strategy. Texas Grant has been in existence since 1999. Why do we make allocations? It seems like that would be something we could roll into the formulas and set a percentage of your general revenue that's appropriated for your institution shall be used for state financial aid, and you use it for Texas Grant, work study. I'm saying this is more of a broader way out there kind of a discussion, Tom, but I think it's germane for what we've been talking about this morning. There would be nothing better than I would like to do is get out of the allocation business. Any comments on that one, Harold?
People are too stunned to respond.
I don't get any allocations, so.
If I may raise a Texas Grant question, one of the issues that has been on the table for a long time in the program is the relationship between the Pell Grant program and the Texas Grant program. We've always targeted Texas Grant toward the neediest students, but we have defined neediest in terms of EFC as opposed to other types of aid or entitlements and so forth. Is there any consensus or are there any thoughts about how Texas Grant should be stacked with the Pell Grant? Are we doing it the right way? What are our alternatives? Should need be calculated as cost minus family contribution minus Pell as people are trying to make Texas Grant awards? What are your thoughts about that?
For me, it goes directly against what we just were talking about in terms of flexibility. The more narrowly we define some of these things in terms of how we award it, the less effective we can be at helping students. That being said, I think trying to target Texas Grant at the lowest income students is the right thing to do. using Pell as a differentiator in there is not going to help us do that better. We're simply then moving the eligibility up above the Pell Grant population by doing that, which is not necessarily then targeting at the lowest income students.
Are the lowest income the neediest?
Now, that's a good question. And I've argued at times the answer to that is no, from the standpoint of if you have a 55-50 Pell, and then you have a student who's just above the EFC cutoff for Pell, but in theory, somebody who has an EFC has a little bit more resources than somebody who doesn't. So, I mean, it's more of a philosophical argument than probably a real argument in terms of how it actually plays out. But I mean, you have a student who is going to start about $500 below the student who has full Pell, but then we don't allow negative EFCs and things like that and how the formulas are calculated. So it's really a difficult argument to say which one is the neediest. Using EFC has been a decent proxy and probably one of the best proxies out there, because as soon as you go to something different, where you start using AGI or something along those lines, then you're getting into, now you got all sorts of people who potentially have resources but have low AGI, and that's not the neediest student or the lowest income student.
And it also, I have a lot of high need students, so the 4,000 EFC serves me very well with Texas Grant. But even our students just beyond the Pell, that's why set-asides are so important, or the funds that we use from our revenue to help cover those students. The problem is if I'm having to take some of those set-asides and cover other things with Texas Grant because of reduced Texas Grant, then that limits what I can do for that kid that's just beyond the Pell eligibility. So that's what I've been struggling with this year, trying to figure out how to balance. I got way too many packaging groups to try to say, okay, this group can get this much, this group can get this much, and that makes it very complicated. But that's part of the reason why set-asides are so important, is because we can actually utilize that for those students that are just beyond getting that needy Pell Grant plus the Texas Grant. So.
Well, we don't have anyone here, it just so happens, except for Henry that I know of, who is from the community college group. Sorry, didn't see you. The discussion has significantly talked or been on the university level. So one of the questions perhaps we should ask is Texas Grant role at the community college, especially for students who have high Pell eligibility. Does it become icing on the cake, and is it, the question of using Texas Grant for living expenses? How important is that for the community college students and their ability to go to school? Can either of you perhaps address that? Any thoughts? Whew, I thought you were leaving.
No, I didn't run. I would have ran if I was late. Carolyn Jones, Collin College. It's off. Oh, it's on. Oh. Carolyn Jones, Collin College. The way that our numbers have exploded, the small amount of Texas Grant that we do get, it's a drop in the bucket. At our school, when Texas Grant first started, we had real high hopes of where it would go and what it would do to help us help close the gap. And with the increase in the number of students that we have that we are trying to give aid to now, we've tripled our financial aid students in 3 years. Hiring freezes for the last 3 years. No new staff. Texas Grant is a very manual process. It's the best way to put it. For the amount of students that we can help with the allocation that we get, it's not unfortunately, it's not a high priority at our institution. I mean, we have so many more students that are getting federal financial aid that is at a higher level. We don't use it for recruitment because we're not recruiting. Because of the economy, we're not having to recruit. It's important to the students that get it. It's wonderful for the students that get it and get to transfer to a four-year university and they have that help there. But like was said earlier, a lot of the students will transfer without getting an associate degree. I'm not saying it's not important at our school, because it is, but it's just such a different environment at the community college level than it is at a four-year university. It's like comparing apples to oranges, and I just think that's something that's really unfair to do to the students.
Carolyn, could you talk about TEOG also in the same context?
We have a lot more students that TEOG would help rather than the Texas grant because of our non-traditional students that we have. I mean, we do have a very big group of students that are traditional students and are going to go and get their Associate of Arts or their arts degree and then go on to a major university or any of the other degrees that are available. But we have a lot of students, especially at the McKinney campus where I work. We do fire science, we do police academy, we do dental hygiene, we do dental assisting, we do the nursing. A student comes to a community college to get a nursing degree. They have a dream of transferring and possibly getting a bachelor's down the road, but the majority of those nursing students are there to get an education, to go out into the workforce and to start making money to support themselves and their families. So we just fill a different spot than the colleges and universities do, and Texas Grant plays a totally different role in the community college than it does at a university level. I know that probably doesn't help much, but
Could I ask, when you're packaging aid at the community college level, to what extent are you able to go into living expenses, or is a majority of the aid that you have targeted at covering the direct educational costs like tuition fees and books?
Our costs are low. It's covered. If they're Pell eligible, it's completely covered. And I mean, I'm not sitting up here saying we want you to take our Texas Grant money away, because we don't. Please don't take it that way. But you know, we've awarded $68 million for 11-12, and that's 7,000 students. The majority of what they're getting is federal aid. The students that are getting the Texas Grant love it. As far as, you know, I don't personally handle it at our campus, but it's just not, it's not the hot button object that it is at the university level. Henry? Come help me, Henry. Henry.
Well, they may not have the room and board at, you know, in the dorms, but they still have the higher commuter costs because they commute every day. And then some students that pursue our vocational technical, like, you know, automotive and even into health sciences, they have higher costs of books and supplies because of all the equipment they have to buy, you know, that sort of thing. So with Pell Grant and Texas Grant, that helps them a lot. They don't have to borrow as much and that sort of thing. Once they get into their health science programs, usually the first year's for some of the prerequisites, and once they get into the programs, they don't have time to go and work. Mm-hmm. The first year RN program, 40, 50 hours, 60 hours is classroom, lab work, clinicals, and that sort of thing. So, you know, it helps them balance their things out, their balance their budgets and that sort of thing. So
Thank you.
My name is Lee Holcomb. I'm with the Policy Institute here, and I would been sitting and listening to this conversation. I've got a number of different comments that touch on a number of different things that have been said. So I hope you don't mind if they seem kind of scattered, but I want to make sure that I put them on the table for discussion with at least a few minutes left. One of the things that I would like to emphasize is in regards to the transfer issue. The commissioner mentioned there's 15% of the students who start out at 2-year actually end up getting a credential, part-timers. I think that we've recently done a cost of degree analysis here at the Institute, and one of the things that we found is that among students who start at a 2-year and who intend to get a 4-year degree, the costs of the total cost expenditures on the students who attrit is 85% of the cost of students who actually end up getting a degree. So there's tremendous expenses on students who actually don't finish. And one of the reasons why I'm bringing that up is because I think one of the things that would be, I think, useful to help frame the discussion is something as someone mentioned earlier, is ways in which we can try to tie the different packages to eventual success. And I think that I think it's something we're all grappling with. And I would cite some internal analysis that the agency did in collaboration with the Legislative Budget Board that showed that there's obviously there's a positive relationship between financial aid received and student completion and student success. And there's varying degrees in the strength of that relationship, but one of the programs that showed the most positive relationship is work study. And I've actually, I think, spoken to a couple of y'all about the idea of the state work study program and ways in which we might be able to utilize the work study program as a means to reduce the need of students to work while they're enrolled outside of the academic mission, which would increase the number of students who hopefully are enrolled full-time, which the evidence shows increases their likelihood of completion. Some of those monies are subsidized, of course, by the private industry, so you've got some subsidizing of the total cost of the private industry where you wouldn't have it otherwise. So there's some efficiencies that you can realize from that. One of the more interesting comments that I saw on a completely different topic, one of the more interesting comments I thought was looking at the possibility of some sort of EFC requirement on renewals. I'm in the middle of some analysis on the financial aid data, multi-wave analysis, and I think it'd be very easy to take a look at what the effects would be looking at the historical data, how much money that would actually result in. And I'd be happy to share that with you as soon as we get that analysis done. I think that's a very interesting idea. I think that looking at the issue of what is the obligation, what costs you cover, and in which ways, academic costs. If you take a look at some of the data on the 2-year institutions in 2010, among those students where EFC equals 0, they received $2,500 on average, $2,500 more in grants and scholarships than academic costs. So I think that, and I got the analysis done for 4-year institutions. I just don't have it in front of me. So I think that there's some additional discussions on how we might go forward on that discussion.
Just tuition and fees
and books and supplies. Yes, sir. And lastly, this is as part of I'm on the front end of an affordability effort, taking a look at these issues, and I would very much appreciate the input of this group on some of the analysis that I'm doing and looking at some of the results and trying to make sense of the results and getting feedback on some additional analyses that might be possible. I mean, one of the advantages, of course, that we have here is that we've got the statewide data, so maybe there's some things that we can do, take advantage of that data that might help you all and might help inform this debate as we move forward going into the next session.
I just wanted to make a comment that's kind of going back to your introduction and make a comment about 4 years or aggregate limit, 30 credit hours or satisfactory progress. I'm from an independent university. I participate in the TEG program, not the Texas Grant program, but as an institution, we've kind of gone through the same exercise that the state is doing about allocation of resources and transitioning and making funding only available for up to 4 years for all types. We have athletic scholarships, merit scholarships, need-based scholarships. You know, all of our aid comes in a variety of things. And all of us here know that our 6-year graduation rates are higher than our 4-year graduation rates. So what it really means is at each institution, we have to institutionally make a commitment, not just in the financial assistance office, but in every academic area, to figure out how can we keep students on track and get them to this 4-year path as opposed to 4.5, 4 3/4, 5, 5.5, because students, as we all know, don't read. They don't know in advance, and they make a mistake. They drop courses here and there. So I think it's whatever we do, it's institutionally we have to embrace it. It's not a financial aid office issue, a state issue. It goes well beyond that. And how do we keep students on track on their degree program, and provide the guidance and keep them from trickling off? So it's just I personally think the 30 hours is, I think 4 years is fine because institutionally do that, but I think 30 hours a year is an unrealistic and will cause some unintended consequences. There's so many reasons why a student might not in a given year be able to complete 30 credit hours, but have the ability to catch up through CLEPs, through summer schools, but to tie it to 30 a year might be problematic. But 4 years or an aggregate, that seems very, very reasonable. So, thank you.
Well, we've only got 10 minutes left. We want to make sure you get out of here on time. It's been very useful to me to hear your comments about this range of issues that we raised this morning. We will continue to talk to you as a group and individually. Tom, I'd like to hear more about your particular issues related to UT Austin, and if any of you have special circumstances that you think need to be taken into account as we try to forge policy for the state, both in terms of the Texas Grant Program, TEG. As you know, there's been a lot of discussion in the legislature about having a common set of rules for all state financial aid programs. I think you all understand what we're trying to do. We're trying to come up with financial aid policy that stretches dollars in the most equitable way possible, and strikes a proper balance between access and affordability. We want to promote both simultaneously, but once again, our fundamental principle, at least my fundamental principle, is trying to achieve the greatest good for the greatest number. And that may mean not that nobody gets 100% of what we might define as being good. I think you're absolutely right that financial aid is simply part of an overall academic strategy that institutions need to develop in order to help their students succeed. It's very clear, and the priority model is part of that. That one of the things the coordinating board has been emphasizing, one of the things we need to do in Texas is we need to strike a proper balance between access and success. That we need to make sure that if we admit students, that we make a commitment to do whatever we can to help them graduate. And I think that there hasn't been an appropriate balance, at least in the time that I've been here, and we need to restore that. Some people have said that we're not, the coordinating board isn't emphasizing access anymore. Of course we are. We just want to make sure that students who get access to institutions of higher education actually complete their programs. We are going to continue to have conversations. We're not going to do anything unilaterally. We do want your assistance in devising policy. We want your frank and candid criticism of what we propose. But it seems to me very clear we are in very much a new age of public higher education in this country. And we are going to have to do an awful lot of things dramatically different than we currently do. And we're going to have to make some very significant adjustments, and a lot of us are going to be well out of our comfort zones. But if you look at the pattern of state support for higher education, we never got up to the after the dramatic cuts in 2003, we never got back up to those levels of funding, and I suspect that we're going to see plateaus and then declines, and then the plateaus are going to get lower and lower, and that means a very different approach to public higher education. We have a mandate from the governor to develop low-cost degrees. I can tell you that here at the coordinating board, we take that mandate very seriously, and we are going to very aggressively pursue the notion of the concept of a $10,000 baccalaureate. We can come close to that now through a combination of community colleges. Some community colleges tell us that they can come very close through their applied baccalaureates. We have to reduce the cost of higher education for the students coming through the pipeline. Once again, I remind you that over half of them are defined by one measure or another as being poor. And to respond to your comment about how financial aid has to be part of an overall academic strategy that institutions of higher education refine. Unfortunately, as all of you know, poverty correlates with going to low-performing high schools. So the students that are coming through the pipeline are not only poor, they're not as well prepared as we would like them to be. They're bright, they're ambitious, they're eager, but they're not as well prepared as we would like them to be. And we've got to help them. So it's in this context that we're having this discussion. If you all have any closing comments, we'd appreciate your point of view. Otherwise, we'll stay in touch, and we will try to refine the model of financial aid in this state that will help the largest number of students accomplish their academic goals. Any closing comments?
I was just going to add, as Dan's aware, I share UT's concern. We took a 28% reduction on Texas grant. I'm not ready to say or suggest that the allocation methodology should be tied to the formula, but one of the things that the legislature asked y'all to do this year was the study of how much of that money should be outcomes-based, and I would argue the same principle could be applied to the allocation of the financial aid programs, that it's also incentivized for success and outcomes, not just for how many students do you have.
A question I have, because the population that is coming out that's in school now, because they're not quite as prepared, are some of the things that we're considering going to hurt them because we're forcing them or trying to force them through the system much quicker than even what the standard is right now? Does that put them at an even greater risk? And then another question is, as we evaluate what we consider success, Henry was mentioning that, or maybe it was Carolyn, that with their nursing program, these students maybe want to be, a PhD nurse, but they understand after 2 years that they can enter the workforce. So are they a success because they have now received a degree and they're now in the workforce? Or because they haven't gone on and received a 4-year or a PhD or something on those levels, we're not considering them a success? And I don't know the answer to that.
Well, let me respond in 2 ways. First of all, we've had a long-standing belief and practice at the coordinating board that any academic credential that students wish to achieve, we will support. We consider certificates from community colleges to be a worthy goal. We have seen a lot of data, for example, that there are some certificates that you can get at community college where you end up with a higher level of income than some baccalaureates from universities. So we respect all credentials, and we want to help students achieve whatever credential they wish. We need to do a better job of advising students about where the jobs are with given credentials and given degrees, but that's another issue. I think one of the biggest challenges we have in higher education, to get to the first part of your question, our expectations are too low. And we hurt students by adjusting policies to low expectations. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that. And I think we need to develop policies that incentivize students to work hard and to finish quickly. And I don't think we don't have the right array of such policies in place now.
And if I could respond to Joe's comments about before we change and I took a 30% cut this year, FYI. So before we change allocation, I understand their concern, and they're right as far as graduation rates of Texas grant students, but before we change any kind of allocation process to be based on a completion, it's the same argument on the academic side when some things were proposed for completion rates. It can't all be based on completion because some of us have more of an access issue. UTSA access and research tier 1, we're competing for both of that. So I think we need to be careful before we uproot the entire allocation process, and that's me going to bat for those of us that would have an issue with that. And we received as much or more of a cut, and it's just as substantial of an issue, hence why I have reduced Texas grants this year. So I just want to make that statement.
Yeah, I don't disagree with Lisa.
We'll put that on our committee agenda for the next meeting.
Thank you.
Okay.
Can I just say, on behalf of the financial aid people and colleagues, I hope I'm not stepping out of turn here, but we appreciate the commissioner's time this morning, as well as Arturo and Dan, the opportunity to actually visit about these issues, because we sometimes get lost in all the weeds of the regulations and need to step back and look at the bigger policy issues as well. And so we appreciate the opportunity to share our thoughts on these issues. And so we appreciate your time.
Very much so.
Thank you.
And I think we'll close it out. Thank you very much. And I think Lynn Kenyon, if you're watching, I hope you get well better. Get better well soon. So whatever like that.
Get well soon.
Get well soon. Thank you.
All right.